Webcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's Energy Central webcast entitled Scott Madden's Energy Industry Update. Everything counts in large amounts. A few housekeeping notes we'd like to mention. For best results in viewing this presentation, we recommend using a wired high-speed internet connection, as wireless connections can be unpredictable. If you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone number listed in the right-hand panel of your interface under the audio section. Following the presentation, we'll have a brief question and answer period. You may submit your questions at any time using the interface on your screen. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to our first panelist and moderator, Kristen Lyons, partner and energy practice leader with Scott Madden. Kristen, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thank you, PJ. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Scott Madden's webinar on recent developments in the industry. The theme of this webinar and of our most recent energy industry update is everything counts in large amounts. With the increasing commitments to clean and zero-emitting generation sources, our topics today are going to focus on various aspects of zero-emitting resources that are being integrated or, in the case of nuclear, potentially lost, and what this all means to the industry as a whole. My colleagues, Paul Quinlan, Subha Nishtala, and Sean Lowery will be presenting on three topics. First, the fattening of California's duck, the Western Energy Imbalance Market, and the loss of carbon-free generation in the form of nuclear. Next slide, please. Our first topic is the California duck curve and how it's grown in recent years. Paul Quinlan will lead this discussion. He's a clean tech manager with Scott Madden, and in this role, he assists clean energy and utility clients with market research, strategic planning, business planning, modeling, and due diligence evaluation. He also co-leads Scott Madden's Grid Edge community of practice. Paul?
Thank you, Kristen. Next slide, please. So I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about the California duck curve. This is a topic that Scott Madden reviewed and produced a report on back in 2016. We looked at what was actually happening in the marketplace in California. And for our latest energy industry update, we have gone back and looked at the numbers and added in more recent years to the data set to see if the trends that we saw last time were continuing. And so we're going to talk about a few things in this section. We're going to level set with some key terms. We're going to look at what the actual net load has been in the month of March. We're going to look at net load over the course of each year in our study period. And then we're going to talk about recent curtailment of solar and wind in California, as well as mitigation strategies that the California ISO is pursuing in this space. Next slide, please. So to get started, on the left-hand side, what we see is three terms that I will use throughout the presentation today. And they're depicted in the graphic that you see on the left. The top line we'll call total load. And what we mean by total load is this is the load that is served by both the electric system, so through the electric utilities, plus the load that is served by distributed behind-the-meter generation. And in the case of California, that's primarily going to be rooftop solar. So that's what total load represents. System load is a separate metric, and that will pull out the distributed behind the meter solar and reflect the load served just by electric utilities. And then finally, we have a third metric, which is net load, and this is the metric that is associated with the duck curve. And what net load represents is it's the system load, and what is pulled out of system load is the variable wind and solar generation. And so it's the full system load minus wind and solar. And both system load and net load may also include imports that are coming in to help meet system needs. And so those are the three terms that we're going to look at. And the important thing about net load is that this is the load that dispatchable generation resources must meet in the system. So on the right-hand side of this slide here, we see the iconic duck curve chart. You see this just about every conference that you go to. It was produced the analysis was conducted in 2013. And there's several years that appear on this chart. And this was California doing an analysis, California ISO doing an analysis to determine what is the impact of variable renewable generation over time to the system. And there's two main challenges that become readily evident. The first one is an oversupply risk during the midday hours. And so As you see the lines as time goes on, this net load in on the day, March 31st, continues to decline year over year. And this is because there's a growing amount of solar that comes onto the system, and during the middle of the day, that all ramps up to peak production. So oversupply risk occurs in the middle of the day. And you'll note that bottom line for 2020 sits at about 12,000 megawatts. That's a number we'll come back to. The second challenge is a steep ramp in the evening. So on the right-hand side then, you see this is a very significant drive up to, and that's the neck of the duct in a 3-hour window. And so in this case, it's about a 13,000 megawatt ramp that occurs in the original CalISO forecast. Next slide, please. So what we've done in our analysis is we started by looking at the month of March. And what we have done here is within each year of our study, which is in this case from 2011 through 2019, is find the day in March that has the lowest belly or midday minimum net load. And then once when we found that day, we mapped the 24 hours associated with that day. So there's a couple years on here from 2011 down to 2019. And then the red line is that original forecast that we saw on the last slide. So that's about 12,000 megawatts right there. And what we see is that as predicted by the California ISO, they were pretty spot on in determining what was going to happen. That line drops over time as the years move on. And so the last year, 2019, the net load bottoms out around 7,000 megawatts. There's about a 5,000 megawatt difference between what California ISO forecasted for 2020 and what we saw in March of 2019. So definitely we're seeing duct curve impacts in the belly part. And if we look at the ramp, we're also seeing a steepening of the ramp. So net load in March 2019, we had a ramp of about 14,400 megawatts, and that occurred from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. And this too is significantly higher than the 13,000 megawatts that were forecast for 2020. So this is a snapshot of March. Next slide, please. These next two slides are going to look at how the duct curve is occurring across the year. And so we're going to start with the belly of the duct. So this is the minimum midday net load. And this chart requires a little bit of orientation. What we've done here is for each day of the year, we have gone and found the minimum midday net load, or that belly, and captured it. And then we've ranked for each year, we've rank ordered that low point for the day. So we've got for each year, we've got each day, and they're rank ordered. And so the lines, each color represents a different year rank ordered. And so what is probably worth drawing attention to first is the right-hand side. This would be the lowest belly seen within each year. And you can see that there's a significant drop over time as we move from 2011 to 2018. So 2011 was about 18,500 megawatts, and that dropped 61% to about 7,200 megawatts in 2018. Something else that also jumps out on this chart is that the low belly and duct curve impact is persistently declining throughout the year. The fact that each line kind of steps down year over year signals that this just is not an issue in March. It is actually an impact that is occurring throughout the entire calendar year. One way to look at this is 80% of the days in 2018 have a minimum net load that is below the lowest point that was recorded in 2011. So the whole line, the lines have been moving down over time. Next slide, please. The second chart here is set up in a similar way, but we're looking at the neck of the duct at this point. So it's a 3-hour ramp. Again, for each day of the year, we've found the steepest evening ramp in a 3-hour period, and then rank ordered them and graphed them by year. And so again, a couple of things jump out. And one last piece, we looked at it between 2 p.m. and 9 p.m. Those were the hours where we were looking for the steepest 3-hour ramp. So again, I draw your attention now on this one to the left-hand side. That's going to be the steepest ramp that the system had to meet. Here we see the steepest ramp, about 6,245 megawatts in 2011, and that has gone up actually 129%, so much bigger increase in 2018, hitting 14,300 megawatts. So the ramping impact is dramatically increased over the time period we've looked at. We also see, again, that across the whole year, the lines are moving up. So again, there's persistent increase in this case throughout the year. And to put these ramps into perspective, the last one in 2018, that 14,300 megawatts, it's about 1/3 of the system peak that was served by California ISO in 2018. So it's a very, very large amount. In fact, that amount is probably most than what most utilities have in terms of peak load. So the grid operators are bringing on a lot of generation in a very short amount of time to meet this net load challenge. Next slide, please. So I want to transition now and look at curtailment, which is one of the impacts that occurs or has been occurring with greater frequency in the California market. There's two sets of data on this chart, and each one is represents monthly megawatt hours. And so the blue on this chart, that is the solar and wind that was curtailed within the California ISO marketplace. And the gray is what the solar and wind curtailment that was avoided, and it was avoided through the Energy Imbalance Market, which Suba will talk about in more detail next. And so what you'll see on this chart, if you look at the gray, the avoided curtailment has held roughly steady over the last couple of years since the market was introduced. But what we see in the blue is that there was a dramatic spike in curtailment that occurred in the spring of this year. So in fact, it even more than doubled from the previous years. One thing to note about curtailment in California is the majority of curtailment is economic curtailment. This means renewable systems submit decremental bids to reduce or quit production. So there's still payments occurring to generators as they're being curtailed. But it's noteworthy that this past spring, there was a very, very significant spike in curtailment, and this will be something to watch next year and the years that follow to see if this trend continues or comes back down. Next slide, please. So this raises the question of how to manage and integrate. If the duck is continuing to grow fat in California, how best to address this and mitigate these challenges or continue to operate the grid under these new conditions. This is data from the California ISO. They have a wide-ranging and diverse set of efforts underway to help manage the duck curve. I'm not going to walk through all of these, but there's a few that I do want to point out. First one would be storage. California's been on the forefront of storage, battery storage. They have existing mandates calling for California utilities to procure nearly 1,900 megawatts of energy storage. Also, what's noteworthy is that within the interconnection queue, roughly half of the systems in the queue now are hybrid systems. And what that means is that is a generation asset that is being paired with storage. So if a lot of those hybrid systems were to come on the grid, that could conceivably slow the growth of the duck going forward, because those systems would be much more dispatchable than standalone solar. Another one to point out on this chart here is time of use rates. California has been transitioning to default time of use rates. San Diego Gas and Electric was the first utility to roll this out earlier this year, and customers now pay peak pricing between the hours of 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. So that's an effort to reduce the neck and that steep ramping that occurs in the evening. Another one is the Western Energy Imbalance Market. As seen from the previous chart, this is an ability to move a lot of that oversupply that occurs into the midday to other parts of the West, and Supa will go into more detail there, but that has been one of the pieces of the puzzle that California has been looking at as well. And finally, electric vehicles. Roughly half of the EVs sold in the U.S. are sold in the state of California. So workplace charging offers a great opportunity to absorb solar and that excess generation that occurs in the middle of the day. Looking out even further, vehicle-to-grid technology, which would take energy in the battery and push it back to the grid, could provide a resource to meet ramping net load in the evening if some of the technical challenges and issues can be sorted out down the road there. Next slide, please. So just a few takeaways as we review the California duck curve. It clearly illustrates how the addition of solar capacity can change net load and grid operations over time. The two primary operational challenges that occur are oversupply in the midday when solar is producing and pushing down some of the other conventional generation. And then in the evening, as solar begins to ramp down, the net load increases and must be met by conventional generation coming on and meeting that steep net load ramp. Our analysis also notes that the duck curve impacts are larger than originally forecast, and in addition, growing in all parts of the year, so it's not just a spring phenomenon. And finally, the California ISO is pursuing a wide range of mitigation strategies, yet more innovation may be needed. David Olson, the chair of Cal ISO's governing board, recently stressed the need to rethink about traditional energy PPAs, and this might be one place for innovation. I'm going to quote him here. He said, "If we paid clean resources to provide power services instead of just energy, we wouldn't have to curtail renewables as much because we could use them not only to provide energy, but also to supply the grid capabilities that gas now provides." So California might be a place that looks for additional innovation and ideas to be sure that they can continue to move towards their clean energy goals while reliably operating the grid. So with that, I look forward to questions later, and I will turn it back over to Kristen. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Paul. That was outstanding. So our next topic is the Western Energy Imbalance Market and how it's facilitating the integration of diverse resources across the Western Interconnect. Subha Nishtala is going to lead that discussion. Subha returned to Scott Madden in 2019 as a director, having previously worked for the firm from 2006 to 2009. He brings more than 17 years of experience in the electric industry, having worked in a number of mission-critical roles and business transformations at companies such as Arizona Public Service and Progress Energy, now Duke. Subha?
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. So the topic I'm going to speak to today is energy imbalance markets in the West. And as far as the content goes, I'll introduce the concept of an energy imbalance market, briefly talk about the benefits and what drives those benefits, and both the direct as well as some of the indirect benefits. Talks about some of the new members that have announced or made their intentions clear, a new market offering that was recently announced, and some considerations for new entrants or entrants that are in the market. Next slide, please. So in terms of what an energy imbalance market is, this is in context to what a resource optimization function is for at an electric utility, across many companies in the U.S. So the mission of a resource optimization function is to coordinate the role or the use of its own resources and to engage the market to minimize generation to meet customer load. This is performed by different groups on the trading floor, and it's done across a multi-horizon time frame. It's done perhaps a year or several years out when you look at procuring long-term power and fuel supply contracts. You also look at there's a group that potentially does short-term, a month ahead, or a seasonal view of doing the same function. And this goes on into the day ahead and hourly time frame. And until very recently, this was the closest that this function could optimize its generation and dispatch. The EIM market, or the energy imbalance market, is an option where energy transfers are possible intra-hour and in 5-minute increments. And this is only possible because of the sophisticated systems that automatically solve for and transfer of energy to serve real-time demand or imbalance across a pretty broad geographic footprint. There's obvious benefits from this. So next slide, please. So one of the unique features of an energy imbalance market is that it seems to have benefits for a number of different stakeholders. It has financial benefits for investors. It has environmental benefits, both operational benefits, as well as some organizational benefits. So if you look at the financial benefits, the energy imbalance market allows for movement of lower cost generation across its footprint, and that results in lower fuel bills for customers of utilities in the market footprint. From an environmental standpoint, you have the imbalance market was really designed to allow for the increased integration of renewables into the grid. And as Paul talked about, it's clearly one of the reasons why California is able to manage or curtail less of its renewable generation. It also allows for less for displacement of electricity from fossil fuels within its footprint. So one of the unique features is the operational benefits from this market. Because the market requires market operators to have situational awareness of all the participants in the footprint, the market operator knows more about what's going on, and that's important both from having additional fuel and resource option to meet any emergent needs that the market operator sees, and that's a key feature for entities like the California ISO. One of the other features for participants is the organizational benefits from joining a market like the EIM. Because there are significant improvements and investments needed to both technology, systems, processes, and even upskilling of employees and their capabilities, organizations see benefits far beyond financial or environmental or operational benefits. Next slide, please. So in terms of the overall benefits that participants see, these are directly proportional to how well the market is doing. What you're looking at here on this chart is the benefits from the Western EIM since 2015. And it's very clear from this chart that the overall market benefits are steadily increasing with the number of new entrants that are entering the EIM. So if you look at it from an individual participant standpoint, what might drive the benefits that any single participant might see? So one of the factors that drives benefits is the amount of transmission capacity you have. Both it allows you to transfer energy through your BA, through your balancing area, or it also allows you to procure or sell imbalanced energy across the footprint. The other factor that drives an individual entity's benefits is the amount of flexible generation it has. And that's important because having flexible generation allows you to ramp up to sell into the market when the prices are favorable, and also ramp down in order to take in energy when the prices are right. As Paul showed on his chart, there are several times where the California ISO is forecasting or generating significant amounts of renewable energy at low prices that if entities can ramp down their generation, they can take advantage of low prices and perhaps negative prices. Next slide, please. So given the benefits from the market and given what individual entities are seeing from the Western Energy Imbalance Market, it's no surprise that there are new entrants that are lining up to join this marketplace. In recent months, 4 such companies have made their intentions clear: Bonneville Power Administration, Tacoma Power, and Avista. And these are entities in the Northwest, as well as Tucson Electric Power in the Southwest. Significant among these is BPA. Their final decision is for the fall of 2021. But BPA is joining the Western EIM market, brings to that footprint significant transmission and generation resources, and is a big move for the Western Energy Imbalance Market. Next slide, please. So given the interest in the Western EIM, the market, recently SPP, the Southwest Power Pool, announced in June of 2019 that it too is launching a Western Energy Imbalance Service. This new offering will launch in 2021, and SPP will administer this on a contract basis, which means utilities do not have to be a member of the SPP RTO to participate in this market. SPP guarantees that its participants will have a say in the ongoing evolution of this market. And from an SPP standpoint, it's just one of several components that it is launching over the next few months and years on products for its customers. Since its announcement, there are three participants that have already announced their intention to join this market. Western Area Power Administration, WAPA, Tri-State, and Basin Power are the three entities that have announced their intention to join this imbalance service. So why would an entity have an interest in SPP's offering? So, for instance, your companies may already have significant transmission ties to SPP, or their operations or their interests may be well aligned with SPP's interests. And finally, if there's a working relationship with SPP from the past, we found that is a good reason why entities would be willing to consider this new offering. Next slide, please. So for entrants that are looking at SPP and at the California ISO's offering, some of the considerations that are important are as follows, what you see on the screen there. Governance is important. The governance dictates how the market service, the rules are determined, how that market service evolves over time, who makes the rules, and how is the body that makes the rules, how are they selected or elected or nominated. The cost and ease of participation is important, both in terms of the systems and the changes that an entity needs to make to join this market, as well as the benefits that it may forecast from joining this marketplace. The market structure and rules dictate how the market is designed, the value that transmission assets have, and the ease of entry and exit. The diversity of resources points to how an entity's generation mix compares to its neighbors, and that has a potentially beneficial effect on overall economic benefits that a participant might see. Next slide, please. So the key takeaways from this recent review of this ongoing evolution of the Western Energy Imbalance Markets, both California ISO and SPP are looking to attract non-RTO members to their fold. And this not only helps with the integration and use of renewables in the region, but also has some operational benefits for these market operators, and that's an important point. The second takeaway is that these markets will continue to evolve, and entities that are either in the market or looking to join the market have to consider the regulatory impacts and the policies that govern joining this market, because the value proposition for being in this market might evolve and change with the evolution of this market. The third takeaway is that participants have an opportunity to improve their organizational capabilities, both from a systems, process, and internal communication standpoint, by joining a market like an energy imbalance market. And finally, the imbalance markets are a toehold for other services and roles and expansion, both for SPP and California ISO. For instance, California ISO has left the door open for expanding the energy imbalance market into the day-ahead market. And we think that this change or this pattern is only going to continue into the future. So clearly there's a lot happening in the West, and we need to stay tuned to these changes that are coming up. So thank you. Back to you, Kristen.
Thank you very much, Suba. So our third and final topic today is the unnoticed loss of carbon-free generation in the U.S. This discussion is based on our analyses of the loss or potential loss of nuclear generation across the U.S. and its implications for meeting carbon goals. Sean Lowry, who is a partner with Scott Madden, is going to lead this discussion. He's been with the firm since 2005 and has worked with a variety of fossil nuclear generation organizations. Sean?
Great. Thank you, Kristen. So we're going to cover three key topics today during the next 10 or so minutes. We're going to summarize the current situation facing the U.S. to decarbonize the electric sector. Second topic we're going to cover is share some of our analysis on nuclear energy's contribution to carbon-free generation. And third, we're going to share our thoughts on what can be done to going forward. Next slide, please. So the current issue is, as you can see in the graphic, is this is 2018's current U.S. electric generation, the sources of where that energy comes from: hydro, wind, solar, nuclear, coal, and natural gas. And if the U.S. were to meet the Paris Agreement goals of 80% decarbonization of the entire sector by 2050, the U.S. energy sector would need to more than triple the amount of carbon-free generation currently provided by wind, solar, hydro, and nuclear. And as you can see, nuclear is a significant portion, over 54% of total carbon-free generation. And many experts suggest that the electric sector needs to get to 100% decarbonization to make up for other sectors such as agriculture to make any sort of meaningful impact if we were going to make a meaningful goal of reaching decarbonization. Next slide, please. So in 2016, we did some analysis around carbon-free generation, and we looked at the potential changes to this generation if the impact of nuclear power plants closing early either closing early due to their end of their operations, they're announcing early, they might have been reprieved or saved by some state intervention to save the power plants, or they've announced that they're in jeopardy, where the current operator has said this plant, if market conditions don't improve, we're going to retire the plant before its current operating license. So if you look at in the total amount of generation of carbon-free from hydro, wind, and solar, and with those givebacks is what we've called it, of any at-risk nuclear generation, which makes up those four categories, we really have taken kind of one step forward with the amount of carbon-free generation and a few steps back with all the nuclear power plants that would be at risk and would be shut down. And that give back would be roughly 47%, almost 50% of any meaningful gains in carbon-free generation. Which led to a question that we did in our next analysis is, can the situation get any better looking into the future? Next slide, please. So earlier this year, we did a forward projection from 2020 into 2035 of the next 15 years based on the growth of the electric generation sector. So that what you'll see is the total amount of load in that top bar, just some orientation, total amount of electricity generation that's going to grow for the next 15 years. And also look at the growth in renewables, both wind for offshore and onshore, solar, quite aggressive growth in solar, both utility and distributed, and looked at any changes in the nuclear generation. And what you'll see here is that the carbon-free generation barely increases in the next 15 years if you take away any of the at-risk generation made up by nuclear. So it's a far cry from making any sort of meaningful gains towards any Paris Paris Agreement and carbonization. So we would need a lot more non-carbon-free generation to make any sort of meaningful impact towards any type of goal. Next slide, please. So what can be done to recognize nuclear's value in making any meaningful contributions to decarbonize the electric sector? Well, first, we've got to recognize the value of nuclear power plants, our existing fleet, towards this goal. This is not a situation where we're choosing renewables or nuclear. It is an and. We need both of them to make deep, meaningful cuts in advancements in decarbonizing our electric sector. The second thing that could be done is that we need to accelerate the construction of wind and solar to meet renewable portfolio standards or greenhouse gas emission goals. The third, and the nuclear industry has made a tremendous advancements and continues to make advancements in this, is support the development of small modular reactors, which have gained some interest as a potential source for scaling non-emitting resource, as well as economic development in very rural areas and deploy those in different ways throughout the United States and Canada and around the world. And fourth, the current nuclear operators are making some significant advancements here with modernizing the existing nuclear fleet, which is improving the efficiency and effectiveness of nuclear power plants by enabling significant cost reduction and operating experiences to compete in the current market conditions without sacrificing any nuclear safety. Next slide, please. So there's 4 key takeaways from this section that we're hoping to cover that I want you to take away from this. First, there's more than 74,000 megawatts of carbon-free generation that is facing early retirement and would have a potential significant impact on carbon-free generation. The second is, if you look at the current nuclear fleet, there's 35 nuclear reactors that are going to have their operating license retire within the next 15 years. And that could jeopardize the nation's ability to achieve deep, meaningful, realistic, near-term decarbonization, as well as the entire economic impact of suppliers and jobs locally and around nationally to help support this very important industry. The third is these early retirements of all at-risk nuclear plants would represent a significant give back of any meaningful carbon-free generation that we've put on the grid. And the fourth is that section of at-risk nuclear generation that we had mentioned, if that is retired early, that's almost 430 million tons of carbon that would be emitted, because we'd have to make up that energy generation with carbon emitting sources like gas and coal. And that'd be the equivalent to roughly 85 million cars, or exactly 1/3 of the current cars on the road today in the United States. So those are the 4 key takeaways. And a couple things to note here, since our analysis was done, that the 3 Mile Island plant in Pennsylvania has recently closed, which was not reflected in any of these figures, and Duke Energy has recently announced their subsequent license renewal of their nuclear fleet as part of their commitment to be carbon neutral by 2050. So thank you very much for your time today. Kristen, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Sean, and our other presenters. We have been getting some questions, and to lead the Q&A, I'm going to turn it over to Greg Leitra, who is our Director of Research and a fellow partner at Scott Madden. Greg?
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks to all the attendees for providing some interesting questions to us. So I guess I'll try to run through the ones we can here today. The first one is for Paul, and the question is, how is distributed solar impacting the duck curve? Paul?
So we didn't discuss this in detail in the slides, but one of the key drivers of the duck curve in California is actually utility scale solar and not distributed solar. And the way we've come to this conclusion is that we have looked at the system load, one of those metrics I talked about before, and looked at that over time. If you line up average system load over time, we see a little bit of dipping in the midday. That would represent distributed behind the meter solar, reducing that need for system resources. But you don't get a graph anywhere near the duck curve trend that we see with that deep belly forming in the middle of the day. If you do that similar analysis of system load for a place like Hawaii, you actually do see a very big drop in system load midday from all the behind the meter solar. So it's probably, at the end of the day, contributing somewhat to the duck curve challenges that California has, but not necessarily the key driver. That's really utility scale solar.
Thanks, Paul. Next question is for Suba. What drove the Southwest Power Pool to create their own imbalance market?
Yeah, so I think there's a few reasons. So number one, the California ISO, does a great job with publishing their benefit study every quarter. And when people read the significant financial benefits that an energy imbalance market or service can offer, it drives interest both in the financial as well as environmental benefits. So I suspect that SPP had a few people reach out to them and express an interest in a similar offering. I would also say that as a market operator, the SPP is and other market operators are looking to expand their engagement with potential customers. So when an opportunity like this comes about, they would want to reach out to members that are not RTO members, full RTO members, or regional transmission operator or organization members, and this would give them a great way to bring more people into the fold without having them join an RTO, which is a much bigger hurdle for many entities.
Good. Another question for you, Suba. You spoke about 4 benefits from EIM. What's in it for utility customers?
So in terms of what end users or customers for utilities, it can be the 2 obvious ones that come to mind are financial and environmental. And financial, there is due to the lower fuel costs because the energy imbalance market is in real time balancing or finding cheaper sources of generation to meet imbalance needs. And the direct result of that is that utilities have access to cheaper generation than what they had planned to generate for that hour. So this results in lower fuel costs, and that would then result in a lower fuel bill for electric utility customers. The other benefit, especially in the West and many states in the West, the customers or members in these states are very conscious and aware about the environmental benefits of an imbalanced market. So anything that promotes integration of more renewables and reduces the curtailment of renewables would be seen as a benefit for many customers in the West. So those are the 2 that come to mind.
Thank you, Suba. The next question is for Sean. The projection of carbon-free generation after 2020 seems pretty pessimistic. So why does the amount of carbon-free generation stay stagnant even as the industry installs record amounts of renewable capacity? Sean?
Thanks, Greg. So the audience member is correct in noting that we are installing significant large amounts of wind and solar, but these low capacity factors of these technologies reduces its renewable generation. In our analysis, we used 25% for solar capacity and 34% for wind capacity factors. And these are just significantly lower than when you compare that to nuclear's average capacity factor of in excess of 92%. So you combine this with the large size of most nuclear plants, carbon-free generation barely increases over the analysis during our time period, that 15-year period.
Thanks. Next question is for Paul. Does the duck curve vary by season or days of the week, and how does it vary?
This is another element of the duck curve that we looked at in the original analysis, and there was some quite striking findings that came out. The impacts are most evident in the spring and fall, and the reason for that is because the system load is lower in those periods than winter and summer. It did show up a bit in the winter months as well, but because of high loads that occur in summer months, that's where we saw the least of duck curve impacts. When we also ran it by day of the week, it was very clear that the duck curve shows up most prominently on the weekend. And again, that is tied to system load needs being lower on the weekend. So the time of year when you would most expect the duck curves to be prevalent would be a nice sunny spring or fall weekend where there's a lot of solar production and system load is going to be lower. So there is some, as you dig deeper, nuance in where it shows up and how prevalent it is.
Thank you, Paul. Next question is for Sean. You mentioned that nuclear plants must be valued both financially and emotionally. What exactly do you mean by emotionally valued?
That's a good question. Well, first and foremost, these nuclear power plants are a major employer in most often significantly rural areas and provide high-paying jobs, which create tax revenue and contribute to the community, which needs to be recognized that these are not. This is a significant portion of our country's culture and employer base. Secondly, the effect on human health. NEI recently published a report that said if 3 at-risk plants in Ohio and Pennsylvania, Perry, Davis-Besse, 3 Mile Island, which has recently just closed, human health would be negatively impacted. In the report predicted that there'd be an increase of approximately 126 deaths per year due to increased air pollution from carbon-emitting resources. And third, and I think this is pretty important to recognize, support for the nuclear industry as a whole comes from the nuclear Navy of the nuclear arm of the Navy. And if we reach a tipping point where the industry won't recover and the U.S. will rely on other foreign nations for its nuclear expertise, that's a significant risk, in addition to the supplier base that would be basically eroded away if this industry closes up shop, for lack of a better term. So that's what I meant by emotionally. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the clarification, Sean. Appreciate it. Next question is for Suba. Do you see the gross benefits from the Western Energy Imbalance Market plateauing anytime soon?
Well, we don't see it, right? If you look at the chart that we looked at, where the benefits from 2015 to 2018 was steadily rising, it's clear that the overall market benefits are increasing, and that's in proportion to the new participation in the market and the broader geographic footprint. So there's no signs of the benefits of the savings plateauing. I also understand that there have been studies done where people have looked at the impact on the region savings or an individual participant savings, depending on who else may be a member of the market and how that market evolves. And to date, and those studies have indicated that there would not be a reduction. In fact, the current level of savings would continue. I think the third reason that's probably most relevant to this is both California ISO and SPP are not approaching the EIM as a standalone market design. They're constantly adjusting and tweaking and making improvements to the service, which will undoubtedly throw out some benefits to all of its participants. So given all of this, I don't see the benefits plateauing or decreasing in the future.
Thank you, Suba. The next are a few questions for Paul. So maybe the first one I'll ask is, would it be correct to note that if some generation directed to bulk storage, it would help smooth out curves? I guess we're talking about the duck curves or ramping.
So yes, if you recall, California ISO has a diverse mix of things that they are pursuing to manage the duck curve. Storage is one of them. In large part, one of the things storage can do a lot of things. It's a Swiss Army knife in the toolbox. Some of the things it can do in a scenario, duck curve-like scenario, would be to store some of that midday oversupply. So when solar is very high and load somewhat lower, storage could be banking some of that energy, and then it could discharge it during the evening peak to help meet the neck of the duct. So the storage probably alone is not going to solve all the problems. That's why the California ISO is looking at multiple things, but storage is definitely a useful tool and could be used to achieve the goal of smoothing it out. One of the challenges is, even though that we do have a requirement in California, 1,900 megawatts, we talked about that steepest ramp being 14,000 megawatts. So storage is still in the early days, and it's relatively small even to the ramp we're seeing in California now. So over time, that may grow as an asset to manage the duct curve as those capacities get higher.
Good, thank you. And then I guess another question for you, Paul, is what is the value of solar curtailment?
So I don't have the monetary numbers of what solar developers are getting paid, but in terms of the value to the grid, one of the challenges that I did not go into more deeply is that dispatchable generation that needs to ramp. A lot of fossil generation, it requires time to come online, and so you can't just turn off the generators and then turn them back on for the evening ramp. So that's one, there's a lead time to get the plants up and running. And then two, they can only ramp down so far, so they have a minimum run. And so where you run into challenges is if there's enough solar on the system and you know you're going to need a set of dispatchable generation in the evening, it needs to be on the system, ready to go and ready to ramp immediately. And so curtailment, what it does is offer the system an ability to, when oversupply is about to push those generators offline, curtailment is an option that is available to make sure that all the generators are online, that you don't push off any conventional dispatchable generation that is going to be needed for the evening peak. So that is, from a system perspective, the value of curtailment. And there's ways contracts could be changed to make that more beneficial or incorporate renewables better, but that's a topic for another day.
Very good. Next question is for Suba. Would participation in EIM result in more cycling of plants, which may increase required maintenance?
Yeah, that's a good question, especially for either new entrants or participants that are going to join an EIM market in the near future. It's very important that you set your unit parameters correctly and you share that information correctly with the market operator. And the reason for that is if you are sending incorrect information about how quickly your units can respond or how much cycle time they need or what your cost profiles might be, the market operator will assume that you've sent them correct information and treat them as such. There are ways to prevent or avoid or limit how much you want to run certain units, and that is usually specified through the data you send to California ISO or SPP. So it's important to make sure you pay attention to minimum uptime, downtime requirements, startup time, and your costs associated with all of that. So if that is done well, we have seen no evidence that there's an increase in maintenance cost from units cycling more in an EIM. However, if those numbers or those parameters aren't set correctly, then at least initially you will see certain behavior from those units operating in a way that perhaps it may not have done so when not in an EIM. So it's a key consideration, and it's important for you to pay attention to that prior to sending that information over. Yep.
Thank you. Next question for Sean, and it comes from a particular attendee. It says, we at EPRI and others believe hydrogen also has a role to play in decarbonization. What is your thought?
So we absolutely agree that hydrogen generation absolutely has a role in decarbonization and has some significant opportunities to fill that void that we had talked about earlier in that 15-year projection, where it would help either augment and potentially fill the gap of that at-risk nuclear, or make a meaningful impact on those carbon-emitting sources. Our thoughts on that is, yes, absolutely, and there's been some recent announcements with the Department of Energy to support projects around hydrogen. It depends on how long those projects are going to be able to go and get to the marketplace to help contribute to that deep, meaningful contribution to decarbonize the electric sector. But absolutely has a role and in our place to make that contribution.
Interesting question. The last question here is, I guess it'll be for Kristen. So it says the last national energy policy was the Energy Policy Act of '05. And what constrains a new national energy policy? Kristen?
Thanks, Greg. So I think it's probably an understatement to say that we're living in politically difficult times. So getting bipartisan legislation is difficult on any topic, let alone on energy. As I think back to when EPAC was passed, so it was passed in 2005. Just 2 years prior, we had a blackout of the entire Northeast. So the electric system was on everyone's mind. And when you think about what we were able to accomplish with EPAC in terms of setting up mandatory reliability standards, enhancing the role of FERC as it pertained to transmission, focusing on transmission incentives, backstop siting authority from DOE, there was a groundswell of support around those policies even prior to EPAC being passed. So I think what that leads us to today is we have a lack, perhaps, of consensus around what's needed in the industry. Having said that, I think there's an opportunity to build what I would call a coalition of the willing around topics that can actually garner bipartisan support. Transmission is a good example. Transmission enables access to low-cost resources of all types, and particularly renewables. As we continue to see renewables commitments grow across the country, it's certainly an opportunity to facilitate integration of those resources. So perhaps we can find some topics in the energy space that would garner this kind of bipartisan support, in which case there may be hope. But anything political today is difficult, and I think I'll leave it there. So that brings us to the end of our time. I'd like to thank everyone who participated today in this webinar, in particular our speakers. I really appreciate you spending the time on this today. A recording of this event will be available on our website, as is our most recent energy industry update. And with that, I'll turn it back over to PJ.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, speakers. Fantastic presentation. For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. As you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending. This concludes today's presentation.